Dilshan returns to his ancestral village, where the rhythms of the coast begin to challenge his lifelong obsession with efficiency. Amidst the scent of coconut milk and the warmth of old connections, he struggles to silence his internal clock and embrace a slower pace of life. Join him on a journey of serenity and soft reconnection as he learns to simply be present. The Saltaire Welcome. The bus door groaned open, releasing a cloud of diesel exhaust and the sudden heavy weight of the coast. Dilshan Pereira stepped onto the red dust of the roadside, his wrist already twitching toward the face of his watch. He noted the time, 14,001:12, and immediately began calculating the discrepancy between the scheduled arrival and the actual stop. He had factored in the winding roads of the southern province, but the driver had taken a detour through a village that didn't exist on his itinerary. The loss of 12 minutes felt like a physical tear in the fabric of his day, a small inefficiency that sparked a familiar, tightening knot in his chest. He stepped back from the road, hoisting his leather suitcases from the luggage rack with a rigid, practiced precision. He did not simply set them down, he aligned them. He placed the larger trunk first, then the smaller carry-on, ensuring they sat in a perfect parallel against the edge of the dusty verge, the handles facing the same direction. It was a corporate habit, a remnant of 3 decades spent managing the high-altitude tea estates of the Central Highlands, where a misplaced tool or a disorganized ledger could derail a harvest. He stood back for a moment, surveying the symmetry of his baggage as if it were a strategic map of his return. Then the wind shifted. A sudden, thick wave of coconut milk and brine crashed over him, cutting through the smell of burnt diesel. It was a scent that didn't fit into a checklist. It was humid and pervasive, smelling of wet earth, fermented fish, and the sweet, creamy richness of a nearby kitchen. Dilshan blinked, the mental tally of his arrival schedule momentarily fracturing. He felt the air cling to his skin, a warm, damp blanket that made the very act of breathing feel like a slow immersion in water. For the first time in years, the internal clock that governed his life seemed to stutter, the gears slipping against the sheer density of the coastal heat. He reached up, running a hand over the sleeve of his cream-colored linen shirt. The fabric was soft, almost fluid, a stark contrast to the starched, oppressive uniforms he had worn in the highlands. In the mountains, everything was crisp, cold, and defined by boundaries. Here, the linen absorbed the humidity, softening against his skin, blurring the line between his body and the atmosphere. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, a slow, rhythmic motion that usually signaled a sense of peace, though right now it felt more like an anchor, keeping him from drifting away into the sensory overload of the village. "You still carry the highlands in your shoulders, Dilshan." The voice was airy, a soft breeze that seemed to carry the rhythm of the tide. Dilshan turned to see Anura Jayawardene standing a few feet away. Anura didn't rush forward with a hug or a frantic greeting. Instead, they stood still, slowly tilting their head to the side. A smile lingered in Anura's eyes, not a wide, performative grin, but a quiet recognition that seemed to acknowledge every year Dilshan had been gone. The stillness was provocative. It demanded that Dilshan stop moving, stop calculating, and simply exist in the space between them. Dilshan felt the urge to fill the silence, to establish a baseline of productivity. He shifted his weight, his voice taking on that measured, steady voice, though he hurried the cadence. "It is good to see you, Anura. The journey was longer than anticipated, though the roads have improved. I've spent the last few years streamlining the estate's export wing, and I managed to finalize the transition of power to my successor just before leaving. I've actually brought a few journals on sustainable soil management that I thought might be useful for the local gardens. I've mapped out a few suggestions for the irrigation cycles based on the rainfall data I saw on the way down." Anura didn't interrupt. They didn't even nod. They simply listened, their heads still tilted, the expression in their eyes remaining steady and open. The silence stretched, growing longer and heavier with every word Dilshan spoke. In the corporate world, a silence this long was a void to be filled or a sign of disagreement. Dilshan found himself talking faster, listing milestones, the promotions, the efficiencies he'd implemented, the awards for quality control, until the words began to feel hollow, like stones dropped into a deep well that never echoed back. Eventually, the heat of the coast intervened. The humidity became a physical presence, a thick, golden syrup that slowed Dilshan's heart rate and made the effort of his own urgency feel absurd. He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth dry, the sudden realization hitting him that he was pitching his life story to someone who was merely watching the way the light hit the dust motes around him. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping an inch. The rigid posture of the estate manager began to wilt under the relentless southern sun. He felt a phantom itch in his pocket and instinctively reached for his phone. He wanted to check his emails, to see if the final reports had been signed off, to tether himself to the world of schedules and deliverables. He pulled the device out, the screen gleaming under the harsh sun, but the signal bars were empty. There was no connection here, only a void where the digital noise usually lived. He stared at the blank screen for a moment, a flicker of panic rising in his throat before he slowly lowered his arm. With nothing to monitor, he was forced to look up. He looked past Anura, toward the horizon where the turquoise water of the Indian Ocean met a sky so pale it looked like bleached silk. "The sea doesn't keep a ledger," Anura said softly, the rhythmic cadence of their voice acting as a gentle correction. "And the gardens do not care for data. They only care for the rain and the patience of the hand that tends them." Anura stepped forward, not to take the bags, but to gesture toward the path leading into the village. Dilshan looked at his perfectly aligned suitcases and felt a sudden, strange reluctance to move them. To move them was to break the symmetry, to accept the chaos of the journey. But the heat was oppressive, and the pull of the ancestral home was stronger than his need for order. He gripped the handles, his knuckles white, and began to walk. As they moved away from the road, the sounds of the village began to bleed into the air. The distant lowing of a cow, the rhythmic sweep of a broom on a dirt porch, the chatter of children playing in the shade of a mango tree. The path was narrow, flanked by overgrown ferns and wild ginger that brushed against Dilshan's trousers, leaving streaks of green chlorophyll on the linen. He found himself counting his steps, trying to maintain a steady pace, but the uneven ground and the thick air forced him to slow his gait, to synchronize his breathing with the slow, heavy pulse of the coast. Just as they rounded a bend lined with towering, leaning palms, a sound drifted through the salt air. It was the distant, rhythmic chime of a wooden bell, striking slow, deep notes that vibrated in the chest. It wasn't the sharp, demanding ring of an alarm, or the precise tolling of a church clock. It was a hollow, organic sound, echoing through the fronds of the palms like a heartbeat. To Dilshan, it sounded like a countdown, though he could not name what it was counting down to. It felt as though the bell were marking the end of one version of himself and the slow, inevitable arrival of another, one who no longer knew how to keep time. The rhythm of the stilts. Dilshan stood where the wet sand turned to slurry, his polished leather shoes already ruined by a tide that didn't care for footwear. He watched the men on the stilts, slender poles of coconut wood, driven deep into the reef, and his mind instinctively mapped the coast as a grid of production. He saw the angles of their lines and the perceived inefficiency of their stillness. In the highlands, a misplaced row of tea bushes meant a loss in yield. Here, the fishermen seemed to be idling in the salt spray, their bodies frozen in a state of suspended animation that felt, to Dilshan, like a systemic failure. He shifted his weight, calculating the optimal distance between the stilt and the current. He wondered why they didn't stagger their positions to cover a wider radius of the incoming tide. It was a reflex, a ghost of the estate manager who had spent 30 years optimizing the harvest of the hills. The urge to suggest a realignment that would increase the daily catch by 15% was a physical itch under his skin, making the humid air feel too thick to breathe. Perched on a stilt 20 feet out was Boudica Gunaratne. He sat with rooted stability, skin the color of cured tobacco, and eyes narrowed against the glare of the Indian Ocean. He didn't look at the water, he studied Dilshan. He had seen the way the other man scanned the horizon with the precision of a ledger. Boudica could smell the city on him, the scent of a man who lived by a clock that never stopped ticking. To Boudica, Dilshan looked like a bird trapped in a glass room, fluttering against walls that weren't there. Dilshan stepped closer to the water's edge, foam licking at his ankles. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the professional inquiry he had used in boardrooms from Kandy to Colombo. "The current seems to be shifting north," Dilshan said. "If you moved the line 3 meters to the left, wouldn't you capture the primary flow of the tide? What is the optimal window for the catch today?" Boudica didn't move. He remained perched on his wooden throne, leaning back on his heels, arms crossed over a chest weathered by 1,000 monsoons. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic slap of waves against the poles. After a full minute, during which Dilshan felt the urge to check a watch no longer on his wrist, Boudica spoke. "Now," Boudica said. A single word, delivered in a voice like smooth stones rubbing together under a heavy current. It wasn't an answer so much as a dismissal. The brevity struck Dilshan as an affront to the concept of data. He opened his mouth to explain the fluid dynamics of the coastal shelf, but he was silenced by the man's absolute stillness. Boudica wasn't fighting the ocean, he was becoming part of its architecture. He was a living extension of wood and salt, a stark contrast to Dilshan, who felt like an intruder in his own ancestral home. "I only mean there might be a more efficient way to approach the bait," Dilshan persisted. "If you used a weighted lure with a higher density, you could reach the deeper pockets of the tide without waiting for the fish to rise." Boudica simply closed his eyes and tilted his head, listening to the sea. He ignored the suggestion entirely, mocking the city man with the luxury of time. He was demonstrating that in this village, the most valuable currency was not yield, but patience. "You're missing the curve of the crest," a quiet voice whispered. Dilshan jumped, turning to find Malcanthe Silva standing inches away. She wore vintage glasses, slid halfway down her nose, a charcoal sketchbook in her hand. Her focus was captured by a single wave curling into a translucent, foaming arc. Her pencil moved in slow, meticulous strokes, capturing the tension of the water just before it broke. "The curve," she murmured. "It doesn't repeat. Every wave is a different story. If you look at the output, you miss the poem." Dilshan looked from the sketch to the ocean. He saw the wave, a fleeting, fragile thing that existed for a second and vanished. It was an exercise in futility. There was no way to archive the wave or improve its efficiency. He felt a surge of irritation at the waste of it. Why spend an hour drawing a wave gone in a blink? Why sit on a pole for half a day to catch 3 fish when a net could catch 100? His thumb began to rub slowly against his palm, a rhythmic, circular motion. It was a ghost of a habit, a tactile anchor used during the most stressful harvests in the highlands. As he rubbed his skin, the roar of the ocean stopped sounding like noise and began to sound like a pulse. The internal clock, screaming for a schedule, began to wind down. The friction in his chest softened, replaced by a heavy warmth that seeped into his bones from the salt air. He stopped calculating. He simply stood there, ruined shoes sinking into the sand, and watched the rhythm of the stilts. He watched the wood sway in the light fracture on the water, and the way Boudica remained an unmoving sentinel against the horizon. The silence was no longer a void to be filled. It was a space to be inhabited. Boudica opened one eye. He didn't smile, but he gave a slow, heavy nod, a weighted acknowledgement. It was the first time he had seen Dilshan not as a city man, but as a man finally stopping his mental pacing. The nod was a bridge, a silent admission that Dilshan had stopped trying to manage the ocean and had started to listen to it. Dilshan felt a wave of calm wash over him, a lightness that made him feel as though he were floating. He closed his eyes, letting the smell of brine and rotting kelp fill his lungs, feeling the slow heartbeat of the village synchronize with his own. He was beginning to understand the luxury of doing nothing productively. But as he opened his eyes, the peace fractured. Far out beyond the stilts, where the turquoise water deepened into bruised purple, a shape emerged from the haze. It was a boat, but not a brightly painted outrigger. This was a sleek, unmarked vessel, a gray sliver of steel cutting through the surf with unnatural precision. It drifted toward the shore, silent and predatory, carrying a single passenger at the bow. Even from a distance, the silhouette was wrong. Too rigid, too formal. The figure wore a dark coat that absorbed the tropical sun, a jarring blot of shadow against the bleached silk of the sky. As the boat drew closer, the rhythmic chime of the village bell began to ring, but this time, the sound felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. Golden Hour Gardens. The gray vessel drifted away as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a wake of churning foam that marred the glassy surface of the lagoon. Dilshan stood on the sand, the warning chime of the village bell still vibrating in the marrow of his teeth. He didn't know who the man in the dark coat was, but the rigid geometry of the boat's silhouette felt like a ghost of the life he had just fled, a reminder of schedules, hierarchies, and the cold precision of the highlands. Anura appeared beside him, their presence a soft anchor. They didn't ask about the boat. Instead, Anura reached out, their fingers grazing Dilshan's sleeve with a lightness that barely registered. "The air is turning," Anura said, the voice warm and airy, like a breeze moving through bamboo. "The night blooms are waking. Come, the garden is breathing." Dilshan followed, the salt crust on his skin tightening as he walked. They moved away from the shoreline and into the coastal gardens, where the scent changed abruptly. The brine vanished, replaced by the heavy, narcotic perfume of crushed nightbloom scent and the musk of damp, black earth. The garden wasn't a manicured space. It was a slow riot of green, where vines draped over stone walls like frozen waterfalls, and the soil felt spongy beneath his ruined shoes. "This patch here," Anura said, stopping beside a cluster of pale, waxen flowers. They didn't cite a planting year or a species name. Instead, they tilted their head to the side, eyes softening. "These are the flowers of the great rain. They only truly scent the air when the wind comes from the south, carrying the memory of the deep ocean. My grandmother used to say they bloom loudest when the village is most quiet." Dilshan felt the old impulse to categorize, to organize the information into a ledger. He thought of the tea estates, where every shrub was mapped by altitude and every pluck was timed to the second for maximum tannin. "In the highlands," Dilshan began, his voice low and measured, "we managed the botanical density with a strict grid. We could predict the yield of a single acre by the slope of the land and the moisture of the—" He stopped. He saw it in the way Anura's shoulders shifted, a small, shy hesitation, a momentary withdrawal. It wasn't a rejection, but a quiet dissonance. He had brought the language of the manager into a space that spoke only in memories. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with the realization that he was still trying to translate the world into a report. Dilshan closed his mouth. He stopped talking. He simply walked, shifting his focus from the logic of the garden to the movement of the person beside him. He watched Anura's hand. It didn't grab or pluck. The fingers brushed against the undersides of the leaves in a slow, tactile dance, a rhythmic caress that seemed to acknowledge the plant's existence without trying to possess it. Dilshan found himself mimicking the pace, his own steps slowing until he was barely moving, his breath sinking with the humid pulse of the evening. "Wait." A whisper drifted from a thicket of ferns. Malcanthe was there, crouched so low she seemed to have grown from the loam. Her vintage glasses were perched precariously on the bridge of her nose, and a charcoal pencil was gripped in her hand. She didn't look up immediately. She was staring at a single, oversized leaf of a monstera, her eyes narrowed in a state of absolute concentration. "Look," Malcanthe whispered, gesturing with a slow, singular finger. Dilshan leaned in. He zoomed his vision, stripping away the garden and the sunset until there was only the leaf. In the dying, honey-colored light of the golden hour, the leaf became translucent. He saw the hidden veins, tiny, iridescent capillaries that didn't appear in the harsh midday sun. They looked like a map of a city made of glass, a fragile, pulsing network of gold and emerald that shimmered with every slight tremor of the wind. It was a detail so minute it was almost invisible, yet it felt like the most important thing in the world. "The light reveals the architecture of the hidden," Malcanthe murmured, her voice barely audible over the distant surf. She adjusted her glasses and returned to her sketch, disappearing back into her private world of lines and shadows. Anura led him further in, toward the center of the garden where a massive, ancient banyan tree stood. Its aerial roots descended like the pillars of a ruined temple, creating a shaded cathedral of gray bark and deep shadow. The air here was cooler, smelling of old wood and wet stone. "This tree has seen every version of me," Anura said softly. They leaned their forehead against the rough bark, a gesture of profound intimacy. "I spent years here, talking to the roots when the house felt too large and the silence too heavy. I think I forgot how to speak to people who weren't made of wood and leaf." There was a raw vulnerability in the admission, a confession of a loneliness that mirrored Dilshan's own, though theirs was a loneliness of stillness, while his had been a loneliness of noise. Dilshan realized that his habit of managing the conversation, of filling the gaps with expertise and structure, was a wall. He had been using his professional identity as a shield, afraid that if he stopped managing, he would be seen as the man who had been gone for too long. He didn't try to offer a solution. He didn't try to fix the loneliness. He simply stepped closer, his shoulder almost touching Anura's. The tension shifted. The cautious nostalgia of their reunion melted into a warm, shared presence. They stood together in the fading amber light, two people learning how to exist in the same space without an agenda. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, staining the sky a deep, bruised violet, a flicker of white caught Dilshan's eye. Tucked into a deep crease of the banyan's bark, held in place by a weathered piece of twine, was a yellowed envelope. Anura noticed his gaze and reached for it, their movements slow and deliberate. They pulled the letter free, the paper brittle and smelling of salt and old dust. "I found this years ago," Anura said, their voice trembling slightly. "I didn't have the heart to move it. I didn't know if the person it was for would ever return to claim it." Anura handed the envelope to him. Dilshan took it, his thumb instinctively rubbing against his palm. He watched the handwriting, sharp, precise, and unmistakably his father's. The letter was addressed to him, dated 10 years ago, from a time when Dilshan had been at the height of his corporate ascent, convinced that the Highlands were his only home. He studied the seal, unbroken and stubborn. The letter had waited a decade in the heart of the banyan tree, a silent witness to the slow passage of time, while Dilshan had been racing toward a finish line that didn't exist. He didn't open it. He couldn't. The weight of the paper in his hand felt like a sudden anchor, pulling him deeper into the mystery of his return just as the first stars began to pierce the purple canopy above. The alchemy of love cake. The scent of browning coconut and cinnamon didn't just fill Lathika's kitchen. It possessed the air, thick and golden, wrapping around Dilshan like a heavy wool blanket. Lathika moved through the narrow space with gliding grace, her palms guiding cast-iron pans across the flame. There was no frantic energy here, no rush to optimize a workflow. She operated in a choreography of intuition, her humming a low vibration that synced with the first drops of rain pattering against the corrugated tin roof, a sudden percussive reminder that the coast was reclaiming its moisture. "Taste this," Lathika said. She didn't look up as she slid a lacy hopper onto a ceramic plate, the edges crisp and translucent, the center steaming. Dilshan reached for the plate, but his left wrist gave a phantom twitch, the ghost of a watch he wasn't wearing, the reflex of a man who had spent 30 years measuring life in 15-minute increments. He felt a sharp urge to calculate how long they had been in the kitchen and what remained of the evening's itinerary. His mind began to build an invisible grid to capture the fluidity of the room. Lathika's hand landed on his wrist. Her touch was light, but it acted as a circuit breaker. Her eyes, crinkled with a permanent, soft amusement, urged him to simply exist. Dilshan froze, the phantom clock in his head stuttering to a halt. He took a bite. The fermented tang of rice batter and creamy coconut milk flooded his senses, grounding him in the immediate present. The screen door creaked open, admitting a gust of salt-heavy air and the presence of Boudica. The fisherman entered, smelling of brine and old rope, moving with a deliberate slowness. Without a word, he pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat, crossing his arms in a manner that had once seemed like defiance to Dilshan, but now felt like a sanctuary. Boudica's silence was no longer a wall. It was an invitation. He caught Dilshan's eye and gave a single, curt nod of acceptance. They sat in the dim light, illuminated by amber lamps and the blue flicker of the gas stove. The conversation began not as a dialogue, but as a drift, meandering like smoke from a dampened fire. They spoke of the monsoon, the habits of the village goats, and the way the light hit the surf at 4 in the morning. There was no goal, no agenda. "The tide is pulling further back this week," Boudica remarked, his voice like smooth stones rubbing together under water. "The reef is showing its spine." "It's a hungry tide," Lathika added, her laughter soft and rhythmic. "It wants to take everything back to the deep." Dilshan listened, lured into the cadence. For a long time, he forgot the tea estates, the yield reports, and the pursuit of efficiency. But then, a cold flicker of anxiety pierced the warmth. It was a corporate instinct, the feeling that he was wasting his retirement, that while he sat talking about tides and goats, the world was moving forward without him. He feared this stillness was not peace, but a slow erasure of his identity. What was he if he was merely a passenger in a quiet room? He looked toward the hallway, where his phone lay on a side table, a black mirror of digital tethers. The urge to reconnect with the noise was visceral. He imagined the blue light and the rush of emails that would validate his existence as a productive member of society. He stared at the phone for a long moment, then consciously shifted his gaze back to the table. He watched a small bead of coconut milk drip slowly down the side of a bowl. He decided, with surprising firmness, to leave the phone where it was. He chose the sensory saturation of the room. The rain, the tea, the sound of Boudica's rough breathing, over the digital ghost of his former life. He felt a quiet victory in choosing to be irrelevant. Lathika appeared beside him with a slice of love cake. The cake was a rich amber, scented with cloves and nutmeg, its surface glistening. As Dilshan took a bite, the sweetness smothered the last embers of his anxiety. The flavor layered honey and spice in a way that felt like a distant memory settling deep in his marrow. He leaned back, a profound sense of surrender washing over him. The rhythms of the village were not something to be managed, but joined. He studied Anura, who was watching him with a knowing smile. There was a shared recognition that Dilshan was finally beginning to breathe the same air as the rest of them. As the meal wound down and the rain intensified, turning the world outside into a blurred wash of gray and green, the atmosphere shifted. Lathika stopped humming. She stood by the counter, her palms flat on the granite, her gaze drifting toward the window that faced the ancestral home. "The house has a long memory, Dilshan," Lathika said, her voice becoming grounded, almost cautionary. "And some memories don't like to stay buried in the soil. Your father knew this." That is why he left the letter where he did. Dilshan felt the unopened envelope in his pocket. The brittle paper suddenly felt like a hot coal against his thigh. The lethargy vanished, replaced by focused tension. "What do you mean?" Dilshan asked. Levika turned to him, her expression solemn. "There is a secret regarding the foundation of your home. Something about the land and the lineage that was never spoken of in the Highlands. It is a matter that requires your attention now, before the lanterns fade and the tide reaches its peak. You cannot wait until tomorrow to open that letter, Dilshan. Some truths are like the tide. If you don't meet them at the shore, they will simply pull you under while you sleep." Dilshan looked at the rain slashing against the tin roof, the sound now resembling 1,000 small hammers. The piece of the meal had been a curtain, and Levika had just pulled it aside to reveal a cold, waiting shadow. The lanterns fade. The envelope was a jagged weight in his pocket, but Dilshan didn't open it. He couldn't. Instead, he sat on the weathered teak planks of the porch with Anura, their silence stretching between them like a physical thing, thick and humming. The horizon was no longer the bright, hopeful blue of the morning. It had curdled into a heavy, bruised gold, the color of a ripening mango left too long in the sun. The air was dense, tasting of salt and damp earth, clinging to his skin like a wet sheet. For a man who had spent 30 years measuring his life in quarterly yields and logistics charts, the sheer lack of urgency in the atmosphere felt like a slow drowning, yet he found himself fighting the impulse to check his watch. Anura sat beside him, their presence a steady, grounding warmth. They weren't looking at Dilshan, but at the way the light caught the crests of the incoming tide, turning the water into molten metal pang. Every few minutes, Anura would shift slightly, the fabric of their linen sarong brushing against Dilshan's trousers. It was a small, tactile anchor. Dilshan felt the phantom itch of his old life, the need to categorize this moment, to analyze why the gold of the sky felt so oppressive, yet so inviting. But he pushed it down. He focused instead on the rhythm of his own breathing, which had finally begun to decelerate, mirroring the slow roll of the Indian Ocean. "The light is leaving us," Anura said, their voice airy and rhythmic, a soft breeze that barely stirred the heavy air. They didn't sound sad. They sounded as if they were stating a natural law, like the tide or the migration of birds. "It's a heavy kind of light," Dilshan replied, his voice low, the steady voice of the coast finally settling into the ends of his sentences. He felt the tension in his jaw dissolve. He wasn't thinking about the gray vessel or the formal man in the dark coat. He was thinking about the way the salt air seemed to crystallize on his eyelashes. Footsteps sounded on the gravel path, slow and deliberate. Malcanthe appeared from the shadows of the garden, her vintage glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. She held a sketchbook pressed against her chest, her fingers smudged with graphite and charcoal. She stopped a few feet from the porch, her gaze drifting from the bruised sky to the two figures sitting in the gloaming. "I have something," Malcanthe whispered, the thoughtful pause between her words acting as a comma in the conversation. She stepped forward and opened the book, turning it so Dilshan and Anura could see. It was a sketch of them. Not a formal portrait, but a capture of a fleeting instant, Dilshan and Anura leaning toward one another, their silhouettes blurred at the edges, caught in a moment of absolute, unvarnished peace. The center of the piece was exquisite, the line work capturing the exact slope of Anura's shoulder and the softened line of Dilshan's profile. But as the eye moved toward the periphery, the drawing dissolved. The edges of the paper remained white, the background a series of hurried, unfinished strokes that suggested a garden and a sea, but never quite committed to them. It was a fragment of a whole. Dilshan stared at the unfinished borders. A year ago, he would have seen it as a failure, a project left incomplete, a lack of discipline in the execution. He would have asked why the composition wasn't balanced or when the background would be filled in, but as he studied the raw white edges of the paper, he felt a strange, surging relief. The imperfection was the point. The image didn't need to be complete because the feeling it captured was already whole. The art was a mirror of the moment, a small island of clarity surrounded by a vast, beautiful unknown. "It's not finished," Dilshan said, his voice barely above a murmur. "It is," Malcanthe replied, adjusting her glasses with a single slow finger. The light changed. To keep drawing would have been to lie about how the evening felt. The gap is where the rest of the world lives. Dilshan nodded slowly. He felt a shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized he was tying for 3 decades. He didn't need the full picture. He didn't need the map of his lineage or the answers contained in the brittle envelope in his pocket to feel the weight of the present. He reached out, his thumb rubbing against his palm in a slow, rhythmic circle, a gesture of profound internal quiet. The mental checklist, the schedules, the efficiency, the constant adjustment of time had simply vanished, leaving behind a hollow space that was being filled with the scent of night bloom scent. As the gold of the sky deepened into a velvet purple, the sound of the waves changed. The crash of the surf retreated, replaced by a rhythmic, pulsing lap against the stilts and the shore. It was a heartbeat, slow and steady, and Dilshan found his own pulse sinking with it. He felt a heaviness in his limbs, not the exhaustion of labor, but the surrender of a man who had finally stopped running. Anura leaned in, their shoulder pressing firmly against his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a silent confirmation. In the press of that shoulder, Dilshan felt a bond restored, a connection to this soil and these people that transcended the years of exile in the highlands. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of Anura's presence act as a shield against the cooling air. The world felt small and safe, reduced to the width of the porch and the scent of the salt spray. One by one, the lanterns began to flicker to life. Lathika moved through the garden with her gliding grace, lighting the oil lamps that lined the path. The amber glow bloomed in the darkness, blurring the sharp edges of the coconut palms and the ancestral home. The light didn't illuminate the world so much as it softened it, turning the garden into a series of glowing islands in a sea of shadow. The air grew warmer, wrapping around them like a heavy wool blanket, pulling Dilshan deeper into a state of absolute surrender. He felt the pull of sleep, a somniferous tide that threatened to sweep him away. The tension of the day, the mystery of his father's letter, and the arrival of the stranger in the gray vessel all felt like distant echoes from another life. He wanted to sink into the darkness, to let the amber light of the lanterns carry him into a dreamless void where the only clock was the tide. As the final lantern was dimmed and the village settled into a profound, heavy silence, Dilshan leaned his head back against the teak pillar. The world was a blur of indigo and gold. Just as he felt himself slipping over the edge of consciousness, a sound sliced through the stillness. It wasn't the wind or the water. It was a voice. Soft, unfamiliar, and precisely articulated, calling his name from the darkness of the garden. It didn't sound like a greeting. It sounded like a summons. Dilshan froze, the peace he had fought so hard to achieve fracturing like thin glass under a heavy boot. He didn't move, but he could feel the presence of someone standing just beyond the circle of the last flickering lamp, waiting for him to answer.